Number 8.
Let's think about perhaps the top 10 things that people would like to know, ought to know about Shakespeare if they're getting into his works. The first thing to say is that he did live quite a long time ago. He lived 400 years ago. So if you're reading Shakespeare or listening to Shakespeare, you're listening to somebody whose language is not quite the language of our current time. You're listening to someone who is writing in a language which is a bit out of date for now. It takes a little bit of effort to understand that language, but the understanding will be done partly for you by the actors if you're hearing it or if you're seeing it performed. Another thing is that Shakespeare was a very great poet. He wrote poems like narrative poems and sonnets, but he was also, and this is my third point, he was also a great theater poet. His poetry is dramatic poetry in the plays. He's not just writing static poetry, lyric poetry in the plays, which is therefore declamation. He's writing dramatic poetry, which consists of interactions between the characters in the plays.
Okay. Now this one is, I think this is a very good example of what we might consider like a beginner piece, right? If you're just getting into the PT or if you've just started listening to lectures in general, this is the perfect kind of introductory type lecture. If you can handle this, you've got the basics for what you need for pretty much any summary. Okay, let's see. Ivy, did you want to have a go at this one?
Yes.
Yeah.
Can I have 10 seconds, please?
Yeah, sure. So as usual, the question is, what were the main points? And interestingly, how many points were there?
I think there are basically two main points.
Yeah.
And the speech starts from perhaps about their 10 things people would like to know when they are talking about Shakespeare's works.
Yeah.
And Shakespeare, he actually lived a long time ago. Is it 400 years ago?
Yes, good. Right. So
yeah.
You don't need the exact number, but we can put it down here if you want. It was 400 years, correct? That was point number 1, essentially. Right. And what was point number 2?
And maybe his language is a bit like hard to understand for the modern people. And he was a poet.
Yeah, good. That was point number 2. He was a great poet, right?
Yeah. But I think there's a last part as well, which talks about his dramatic poetry.
Yeah, exactly.
Which has something with the characters or.
Yeah, it's about character interactions. So good. Now, excellent. That's pretty much all we needed for the entire summary, right? So it's kind of 2 parts. Now, interestingly, she actually said it was 3, but I think 2 and 3 were basically the same thing, right? Now, this is the reason why I say this is a very good entry level kind of lecture is, let's play it again. One of the things I always say to people is you want to pay attention to the structure of lectures, the way that the information is organized. And this is one of the easiest ways that information can be organized. She literally says the first thing, and then also here's another thing. Okay, so listen carefully to her organizing particles when she talks.
Let's think about perhaps the top 10 things that people would like to know, ought to know about Shakespeare if they're getting into his works. The first thing to say is that he did live quite a long time ago.
So the answer here, the information is that he lived a long time ago, right? But notice how she begins her sentence with the first thing. As soon as you hear something like the first thing, that's an indication I should start taking some notes, right? This is my important topic sentence. And then after that, She's going to go into a lot of details. She starts talking about how the language is harder to understand, blah, 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 right?
He lived 400 years ago. So if you're reading Shakespeare or listening to Shakespeare, you're listening to somebody whose language is not quite the language of our current time.
So you would expect after she gives her topic sentence, there's probably going to be some descriptions, some explanations, stuff like that. No problems. And then we wait for point number 2. At some point, she's going to introduce a second idea, right?
You're listening to someone who is writing in a language which is a bit out of date for now. It takes a little bit of effort to understand that language, but the understanding will be done partly for you by the actors if you're hearing it or if you're seeing it performed. Another thing is that Shakespeare was a very great poet.
Stop there.
Another thing.
Yeah, right. So the organizing particle is the another thing. The content is that he's a great poet, right? So you can think of these sentences as being built up of like a bit of an organizing, a structural element, and the actual content, the information that's being given. Quite often, right, if you want to get good at listening, right, focus on the structural elements as well. As soon as you hear another thing, you're thinking, great, that's point number 2, right? He's a great poet. And there might be some more explanations there.
He wrote poems like narrative poems and sonnets, but he was also, and this is my third point, he was also a great theater poet.
He's also a great theater poet. That's her third point. Although I'm going to say 2 and 3 are kind of so close together, you can treat that as just one general idea. Okay, and then after that, she goes on to describe in a bit more detail exactly what a theater poet is, and it's a good idea to put in a little bit of that description, right? But you can see here that because these transitions, right, the topic sentences are so obvious, it's very easy for you guys to pick out what the important information is. Okay, so this type of lecture is usually a good place to start. Stuff like the previous ones, like language death and industrial revolution, to be honest, if in the beginning you can't really get these, that's actually quite normal. Okay, but start with some of these easier ones and see whether or not you can pick out which ones are the topic sentences that you need to note down. All right, now I think we might have, we have time. Let's do one more before we finish off tonight.